Thank you. And we are starting a little later, but I will still aim to end on time so everyone can have a lunch break and discuss the really important and challenging topics that we've covered this morning. I'm really pleased to be moving on to the sort of the second phase of the day as it has been described in our programs, to really look at the disclosure frameworks that we can be putting forward. I think it builds on that excellent session that we've just had about how do we communicate what the institutions, central banks, but also private institutions are doing to really push forward the climate-related exposures that they are climate-related responses to the exposure, and we're to be tackling here today. So I'm very pleased that we have Jean Voisnat, who is the head of the Secretariat for Networking for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. I'm going to use that acronym from now on. We used it in the last session, so I'm very pleased to do that. We also have Karen Ellis here from WWF, the chief economist. So pleased to be talking about the responses to climate that we've seen, but also one of the things is that we can delve into is actually looking at the supply chains that we're doing, especially if we're talking around technological innovations. What implications does that have for the environment of the globe? And then we also have Judson Berkeley, who appears like magic in front of us from the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So perfectly pleased to have you all here. Thank you so much. I'm Ellie Gross from OMFIF, and I'm going to start with you, Jean. First of all, to ask if you're going to be doing a TikTok or just a YouTube for this, maybe a TikTok on biodiversity, and then also ask your perspectives on the importance of having a consistent way of thinking about nature-related risks, and a little bit on what the NGFS is doing around this topic.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you for having me today. So no TikTok planned yet, but there are people thinking about the NGFS communication, and I don't know whether they will have some strange ideas. Anyway, I think we are into strange ideas or at least disruptive ideas in the NGFS. Maybe just a word. I mean, you mentioned biodiversity, and for the NGFS, it has in fact been quite I would say a journey to understand. So we called ourselves at the very beginning, 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago now, the Network for Greening the Financial System. It was not the Network for Central Bank Climate Action, and that meant something from the beginning. So there was an intuition, I think, at the very beginning of the network around these questions, but it was quite clear that climate is already quite a piece to address and to do it well. So we postpone basically looking beyond climate to a later moment. I mean, what we have been facing is in fact a combination of evidence mounting that there is a need for looking beyond climate or looking at the other aspects of climate. There is this nature-climate nexus, which is an important one. There is also ongoing work that was undertaken in the NGFS. I mean, we have done basically the due diligence of is there some kind of material risk that would force us or lead us to look into these questions. And I also should insist that there was, I think, the gut feeling of the members, and I can remember a discussion with the deputy governor of a country, in a central bank operating in a country in the tropical regions, basically telling us we see climate change coming at us quite fast, but honestly we also see nature-related things coming at us even faster, and that we need to get ready for it. So that's this combination that basically led the network to say, okay, now we need to look into that, and the first thing was really to try to build a common understanding of that, because to be completely honest, climate, it took a while for us to speak the same language. Nature and biodiversity, each and every one of us, because we sit in some kind of specific places and so on, we have a completely different approach to it, and it's quite clear that if we want to be effective, we need to have this kind of common representation of what the problem is and how to look at it. And that's how the work of the NGFS has started, basically trying to build that common understanding, make sure that we don't have a discussion that misses its goal, and that we don't misunderstand ourselves, in order to be able to then take into account what needs to be taken into account in supervision, in financial stability monitoring, monetary policy, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will touch on some of those issues in a little bit as well, but Karen, I want to come to you. Could you outline how you define integrating biodiversity? So I'm just asking Karen to define how to explain how they define integrating biodiversity, and also the key challenges that you see for the financial system. But I know you've done some works on the role of central banks in addressing this. So I kind of want to tell the story about the central banks, and then we will also touch on how other stakeholders and are integrating nature into transition frameworks. But let's start with the central banks as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity today. Just to start by saying, we have done films for TikTok and many other kinds of films. If you've seen our film, Our Planet Too Big to Fail, that's about the impact of the financial system on nature loss and climate change, and what it can do to solve that. And if you're watching Wild Isles on Sunday evenings in the UK at the moment, that's a film that we were part of producing as well with David Attenborough, that really looks at nature's impact on us and the costs of nature loss. So we're doing our best to educate the public on these important issues and to get everybody behind the action that's really needed on this. So, sorry to answer, that was a little bit of a plug there.
No, I'm pleased. Excellent.
To answer your question and to build on what's already been said, and it's great that the NGFS and also the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action have both published reports in recent times setting out the importance of nature loss as a risk to our economy and to our financial system and financial stability. So that's gaining wider recognition now globally, including in mainstream financial circles. And the point is now landing that financial regulators and finance ministries need to be taking a lot more action to address this risk, which, as you said, is equally important and urgent, actually, as climate change. And very interlinked with climate change, I would say, as well. So this comes to your integration point. We know that we cannot achieve net zero without tackling nature loss. The scientists, the IPBES and IPCC reports that came out last year pointed out that at least a quarter of carbon emissions are associated with nature loss, particularly deforestation and land use change, often associated with the food and agriculture sector. Also, nature can provide up to a third of the emissions reductions that we need to see going forward. So both nature is a big part of the problem in terms of nature loss, and a big part of the solution. And given the strong interactions between climate and nature outcomes, it's very important to think about these two issues together. And the science is beginning to give us some pointers about how to do that. So we've been arguing that nature should be integrated into the fast emerging net zero policy and regulatory framework. Doesn't make sense to look at climate and nature separately. So let's start to try and integrate nature into that thinking at the same time. I can say a bit more later perhaps about our work on transition plans. We're part of the UK government's transition plan Taskforce on how to integrate nature into transition plans, so we can talk a bit more about that. Also just to note that the UK government and many other governments signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Biodiversity Framework last year, December last year, which commits all of those countries to tackling nature loss, to reversing it, restoring nature, and aligning the financial sector to that goal. So many countries are now signed up to doing that, and yet we're only very much at first stages of actually working out how to do that. So it's good that central banks are beginning to address this issue, and I think some of the things we would love to see central banks doing on that are really assessing the vulnerabilities of the financial sector to nature loss as well, and trying to integrate that into these scenarios that are being developed on climate change that we've been hearing so much about, but also then setting expectations of financial institutions around their own management of these risks and assessment of these risks, drawing on tools like the Taskforce for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, emerging framework that will help financial institutions to assess those risks as well, and then beginning to actually align both their regulations and their asset management to those goals, net zero, and it will become nature positive, I'm sure, in due course. But I'll stop there for now, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to come to you, Judson, now to talk about how the financial sector as a whole is currently thinking about nature risks. So what are the key opportunities associated with this as well? And how has you seen the thinking evolve?
First, thank you to UMFA for organizing these excellent sessions. Apologies that I'm not able to be there in person. There are probably two reasons. One, we're in the final throes of finalizing our TNFD release, which is due the end of this month. But also, my day job actually is with UBS, and it's certainly been quite an eventful set of days here in Switzerland in the financial sector. So I do appreciate the chance to still participate virtually. I think there have been some great points made so far in the last session and this one, and I do think in a lot of ways nature is following a climate playbook as we try and talk a little bit internally here at UBS. And certainly we can learn from some of the activities there and ultimately how to probably accelerate some of our work faster and focus it to be more effective. Certainly there is disclosure, and that's what I've been involved with most directly on the TNFD work, and certainly that is almost a precondition at times to get some of the basic information out into the public domain to really then facilitate the risk analysis. And certainly that analysis is key to understanding where exposures lie, where sensitivities lie. But ultimately, it does come down to the transition activity. So we just heard the transition planning mentioned. So I do think target setting and transition planning will become equally critical. And the sooner we can bring that into the discussion and have a good balance between the risk analysis and the transition planning, I think that will be to great benefit. I think it's one of the learnings perhaps learned from climate is we've spent lots and lots of energy into risk analysis, and we heard in the past sessions some of the limitations around that, but ultimately it's about the action, and that comes from the transition and target setting. So I do see that as a very critical pillar of what we need to do going forward. But I'm happy to expand a bit later on where the task force is and to talk a bit more about the financial sector as well.
Thank you so much. I want to come back to you immediately, actually, Justin, to talk about some positive concrete examples of how organizations have successfully integrated the TNFD framework into their financial disclosures. So actually get some concrete examples I think would be really helpful, because I think that sometimes with these discussions, and while they're excellent, we talk around that kind of top level, what would be nice, what needs to happen. And I really think that we should be delving into what has been success and what does success look like, and how can we all learn from each other.
Yeah, well, first I guess I have to caution you, the TNFD framework isn't there yet. Yeah. It's been coming out in draft versions. I mean, as I said, we'll have the version 0.4 at the end of this month. The final version is due in September of this year. But certainly I think there's a lot there to build on. And this idea of integration of the climate and nature focused disclosure is absolutely critical. That's been the positioning of the TNFD from the beginning, and one thing we see as a key element of making it successful and having a broad uptake. I don't think financial institutions are building from zero by any means. I think a lot of financial institutions have been considering broader nature topics beyond climate for many years. A lot of banks and other asset managers as well have had engagement policies around issues like their activity with, say, the forestry sector, or with issues like palm oil. So it's certainly not a you start from zero sort of situation, but there is clearly a step change needed here to really understand some of the critical issues within sectors more deeply, to try and quantify where possible, to try and build off of the public policy objectives that now are clearly in place through the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in Montreal last year. So what firms I think are trying to do is particularly in the financial sector, starting from what has worked a bit on climate to date. So at some level, you're starting with basic heat maps to try and identify potential sensitivities or hotspots within broad portfolios. There's some key tools that everyone has gravitated to, because they do capture some of the best understanding from the scientific community on this. Things like ENCORE, things like IBAT, things like the work done by the Science Based Target Network. In the financial sector, we don't necessarily have the deep expertise in biodiversity and the nature-related topics, so we need to work with, in a collaborative way, the scientific experts. But certainly heat mapping has been one tool. I don't want to promote UBS too much, but we did try to publish the first version of a nature risk heat map along with our climate risk heat maps in our most recent sustainability reporting for our balance sheet exposures only. Some other firms have done something similar. The Spanish bank BBVA in their reporting also published something. One of the best examples, honestly, I've probably seen, and it shows that maybe not all the good ideas reside in one place, comes from a bank in Taiwan eSun Financial, which actually had a very well-developed impact and dependency-based heat map. And I think those heat maps are great starting points. It gives you your place to focus, but ultimately it is a bit of a drill in. And as we've seen on climate, it's about also some level of just having bottoms up understanding to start to differentiate within sectors, company A from company B, whether that's for investing, whether that's for lending, and really starting to understand more deeply of their sensitivities based on their impacts and dependencies. And the critical aspect when it comes to nature, obviously, is their locations of their direct operations, locations of their value chains. And that's really going to be one of the bigger challenges around thinking through the nature topic as opposed to the climate topic. You don't have that fungible CO2 emission number, doesn't matter where it's emitted, it has the same impacts. Obviously with nature, the local specifics really do matter.
Thank you. And actually, I want to pick that up with Karen on around the implications of when we're looking at integrating nature-based risk into these disclosure frameworks, actually the complicated reality of the fact that this is actually covering a lot along, especially in our long supply chains. And I think that is a really interesting thing to start to explore, and the responsibility that the biodiversity and then this disclosure, where that responsibility sits along that supply chain. So kind of the work that WWF is looking at with this.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think just to build on what was just being said, there is already a lot of work within many companies and financial institutions on nature-related policies and targets. So it's not that behind on that level. It's not very integrated in climate for the most part yet, so hopefully that can happen increasingly going forward. So companies have been grappling with that already, including down supply chains. But there are many significant challenges down supply chains, especially when obviously companies may have one jurisdiction that's telling them to do that, whereas the countries they're operating in have no such regulation or policy support for that kind of thinking. So it makes it very difficult for them, especially competing with other players who are not coming from that jurisdiction, to take strong action. However, in the context of the transition plans work that's now going on, so we are part of we sort of convene a group of companies who are sharing lessons on how to integrate nature into their transition plans so that we can all learn together on how best to do that. There's a lot of conversation about the need to come up with joint solutions down supply chains, particularly, including in producer countries, to actually provide frameworks that a larger group of buyers up the supply chain can come together and ask for the same data from the producers on the ground, because otherwise it's too difficult to get producers to provide the right data. So there's definitely going to be a need and a growing demand for coalitions and groupings of companies to come together. Arguably it could be done at the jurisdictional level, but that isn't yet happening. But companies coming together at least initially to provide frameworks that give producers in particular countries stronger certainty that if they take action to invest in more sustainable methods of production, for example, that will get them a benefit in terms of being able to sell up those supply chains. So that there is a lot of conversation going on about how to do that, and that's the kind of thing that players like WWF and many others can also help with in terms of convening and sort of neutral facilitation of those kinds of conversation in different parts of the world. So yeah, there's going to be a need for a lot more work in that space going forward.
And John, when you're looking at this from the regulatory framework, or when you're looking at this from the NGFS, how are you trying to build a sort of a cohesive taxonomy perhaps around this? We've struggled with a cohesive taxonomy for climate. I can imagine, and I had the same conversation with the Dutch Central Bank, which was referenced earlier, around how even more complicated it is when you're looking at biodiversity. And actually, where do you think we are along that pathway?
So you use the taxonomy word that I think everyone in the room wanted to avoid.
Apologies.
No. Just joking. But I think I think we are a bit before that, to be completely honest. Because if you want to have a proper engagement, a proper disclosure, etc., I think it's really important. And let me insist on having a common understanding of the scope and nature of the problem that we are facing. And typically, we have had a discussion in the NGFS. Should it be climate plus, or should it be a generalization of climate? I mean, this might seem like trivial questions, but in fact it is determining so much after that it's an important discussion. The way we are advancing today is more like, especially because indeed you cannot solve climate without taking into account the nature part or the nature dimension of the issue. But still, if you solve climate overnight, which I hope we would, but you would still have a few. Water stress would not disappear overnight. So in fact, nature is a bit broader than that, and to us, the real challenge is, in fact, to develop something that is consistent with the way we have approached climate so far, but is generalizing it to other risks. So maybe in due course we'll come to being able to develop things like taxonomy and so on. But we are missing so much of the common language at this stage to be able to do what needs to be done consistently and avoiding also to fragment the approach. You were speaking to the global policy fragmentation, which I think is a big issue. And on the NGFS side, we are really trying to avoid, this fragmentation by accident, because some would have insisted more on that, and some would have insisted more on that, and so on, so that we make sure that we start off the same foundation to solve the problem. Even though, and again, to speak to something that was already mentioned. The local dimension is very important. We are not facing the same risk in Western Europe, here in the UK, or in the tropical belt, or wherever. So, and that's something also we should recognize. But we should have the same way of approaching the analysis or the risk assessment to make sure that what we are picking up is not because we have different lengths, different way of thinking about it, but because we are facing different circumstances.
Thank you very much. I want to open it up to questions as well. So please do indicate if you have a question for the panel. I have a few of my own as well, so I'm happy to continue. While we just wait for the microphone, one of the things that I know to be true in the UK House of Parliament, one of the highest number of letters that MPs get is around the bees and protecting of bees. So there is a huge focus from the population to ensure that this biodiversity and an understanding of the importance of biodiversity. But I think it would be interesting to continue that conversation around how we widen that up, I think, from the local perspective too. But please, could you identify yourself and then ask the question?
Yeah, and Anthony Belcher from ICE. I think it's maybe a question for the NGFS side of things in terms of scenario development for nature and how that will play into the framework that TNFD is developing, and how people will use scenarios to develop and manage their risks.
Yeah, so there is basically two things happening on the NGFS. On the NGFS side, the one thing is to build this framework that I was speaking about. The collective understanding of how the problem should be looked at. That's on one end. On the other end, and in parallel, we are starting to develop or to look into what does it mean to develop a nature-based scenario. That's very much work in progress. I expect that to land sometime, in fall, something like that, or to become public at that time. What I can say is that, given the local nature of the risk, I'm not sure that we will end up with the same kind of global scenarios that we have for climate, but very much insisting on how to build up your scenarios once you have done your risk assessment and that you have understood what is material for your economy.
And then perhaps there's a follow-up for Justin. How do you envision using the NGFS scenario within your framework for your financial disclosures?
Yeah, certainly having some common scenarios, whether they're truly uniform global or whether they you need to break down in some local aspects is absolutely helpful. We've seen that obviously with the climate risk analysis, and we've seen it with the corresponding transition planning. Lots of people using things like the IEA scenarios to frame their transition plans. I think the extent that we can get some of those common touchstones, as Jean mentioned, that would be great. Some of it, even I think some level comes out of the global biodiversity framework. There are some key targets in there. The 30 by 30 objectives. There are other objectives around reducing nutrient loads, reducing food waste. So I think there are a number of things that you can already start to think about in terms of target setting and what you can really start to measure, even in the absence of these agreed scenarios. I do think we need to be pragmatic here and think about what are the things that really match to how companies manage themselves. What are the things that the financial sector can talk with companies, the industries about, how they, what are their strategic plans, how are their production processes oriented, where are they sourcing from? Because I think there are things we can already start to work with today as some of the knowledge builds out, as it consolidates, and as we work towards these common scenarios.
I'll come to the question in a second. I just want to ask Karen. We heard already today the dreaded phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And a concern, is there a concern that this focus, this correct focus, that everything in biodiversity is very localized, that you have to take different scenarios and different perspectives on where the value chains are and where we are looking at the globe, that you then end up talking around the subject before and action isn't taken forward quick enough? And actually, how concerned are you for that? So how do you balance those two very real risks?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I do worry that we're getting so mired in the complexities of modelling of all of this stuff that obvious, no regrets things we should be doing now are just being missed, or it's almost like diverting attention onto that techie stuff when really obvious opportunities to take action, especially at the policy level, are being missed. And so, and also at the company level. So, for example, I think the obvious no regrets action for companies is to look at their impact on deforestation and exposure to deforestation risk. That's a very complex area as well on its own, actually. But there's potential for companies to work together to identify solutions and transparency down the supply chain that would actually enable much more transparency and disclosure around deforestation impacts as well. And that kind of thing can have a significant impact on climate change impacts through emissions, through deforestation. So there are things that we should be doing straight away. There are policies that can be put in place to really strengthen and support that. So I would say that we should do that. The other thing to say is there's already a lot happening, I think. We do a regular assessment of central banks and wider regulatory policies called SUSREG. The last one was published in December last year. I think it looked at 44 countries or something like that to look at what their policies were on this. And I think 40% of them do have some degree of wider environmental issues being taken into account beyond climate change, including nature. So that's often about asking companies or giving guidance to companies about thinking about nature-related risks. But that's a good start, getting companies to think about it, using that data, monitoring that data to actually start learning about the risks themselves. So I think there's a lot that can be done before full information is available just to help us to navigate this issue and to start taking the obvious action we know we need to take straight away.
John, you looked like you wanted to come in here, so
yeah,
I'd like to give you the floor.
Apologies that it was so visible. No, I fully agree. I think the challenge to us is to go past beyond these no regret obvious things for which we need to build these frameworks. And I think the framework basically is around in 4 words: nature rather than biodiversity, because it's a broader topic. Impact and dependencies. And something that, lack of substitutability. In fact, what I think the main challenge is that we don't really understand what's in front of us with regard to the risk assessment part of it. And that's what people are not realizing, that in fact, half of our GDP, roughly, depends somehow on some services that we are not sure we will keep on having in the future. But no one has really, is half of the economy disappearing overnight? Or what will happen? And that's the question we need to make progress on to be able to develop sound and effective risk management.
Thank you. And I would like to know.
Yes, hi. Theodora Antonakaki from the Bank of Greece. I would like to hear the panel's views on pricing in externalities. We heard on the first session that there is the sustainability benefit versus financial gains. Then on the second session, we had that we are moving away from carbon pricing, especially through the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that the discussion has already moved away from carbon pricing. So what are your views on pricing externalities? and pricing in the cost of doing business? Thank you.
I think I will first of all ask Justin you to tackle this quite, I think, even furtherly complicated question in regards to biodiversity than as you touched on this earlier around the carbon pricing perspective when we're looking at tackling the climate crisis. But how do you translate that into nature-related risk?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, pricing is the economist's, favorite instrument for these sorts of things, and if we could do that credibly, that certainly would be helpful. And there are efforts underway at this, in terms of trying to really monetize externalities and really reflect those into the financial statements of companies. I do think this is work that's going to continue to need some investment over a number of years. But this idea of sort of impact P&L accounts that really could reflect essentially a company's positive and negative impacts along with their financial impacts, I think would be quite an interesting development if that could be done. But I think that's it. It's going to take time, clearly, and I think there have been some good points made about we need to find some ways we can move forward in absence of maybe some of these first best solutions, and so certainly having policy frameworks that can guide pathways for industries, having some key issues that are looked at, such as deforestation, as was mentioned, plastics, another example as well. You have to think about sort of what are the ultimate goals that we have, and how can we sort of start to think about the evolutionary path of different activities or industries, and then what can the financial sector do to accelerate that? I think we shouldn't lose sight of is that was made quite well before, is certainly your risk analysis is necessary, and that level of understanding is very helpful. But if we achieve transition, we actually achieve effective risk mitigation, and that is effective risk management. So at some level, I think we also should sort of absorb some of the lessons from our climate as work, and the more we can focus on that transitionary element, I think we give ourselves the best chance to mitigate risks, be they transition risks or physical risks.
Thank you. We've got 3 questions. We've got 3 questions as well in the audience. So I will just come, if you could answer this question quickly from there, and then I will take those 3 together, and that will take us into the last 5 minutes. So, Jean, how do we price this? How do we price this nature-related risk?
Honestly, I don't have anything more to add to what was just said.
Well,
but I'm an economist,
Yeah, it's a complicated question. Totally agree. Externality is a massive problem, and we've got to overcome them. A lot of that's got to be done through policy change, I think. And if you read the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, very long report, set out lots of different ways that you could do that, and it has to be country-specific to some extent as well. But so ministries of finance and other ministries need to take responsibility for putting in place those policies. But in fact, we're finding that that's the pushback we get from financial institutions anyway. You're asking us to do a net zero transition plan, but you're not giving us the policy that actually enables us to do that in a profitable way. Same with nature. So I think we need ministries of finance and governments to take responsibility for putting in place the policies that drive that investment in nature and in net zero transition as well.
Thank you so much. We've got 5 minutes, so I'm going to take it. There is also a gentleman there who can have the microphone, please, after we've taken this first question here.
Paul Rankin, VSA Capital. Can you just suggest some ideas on how we can quickly and easily get more investable instruments into the marketplace, into biodiversity, wherever they may be in the world?
Excellent. So instruments into biodiversity. This lady at the back of the room.
Thank you. One view of the world is that the financial system is a recipient of biodiversity-related risk. Another view of the world is that the financial system is a driver of biodiversity loss, and therefore it falls within the mandate of a central bank to help mitigate that. I'm curious to know, in the kind of NGFS group, how many of the participants solely take a recipient of risk approach in terms of how they manage their operations versus how they try and actively use the financial sector as a driver to stop biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the gentleman there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. William Atwell from sustainable Fitch. I just want to point out regarding nature-related scenarios, there was actually the UNPRI FPS Plus Nature scenario launched in January this year, which I was fortunate enough to participate in the launch of. So there is work going on there. I wanted to ask the panel's opinion about when climate action and nature action potentially work in conflict with one another. We know we've been talking about how they interact, obviously, in the real world. But in some of the measures, for instance, that are being taken to accelerate investment in clean technology, I'm thinking about some of the incentives in the proposed Net Zero Industry Act launched by the European Commission last week, and also the Critical Minerals Act, draft Critical Minerals Act, to accelerate mining projects for rare earth minerals in the EU, for instance. Could that potentially be working against some of those nature protection and biodiversity protection objectives that presumably we all think are important here?
Thank you very much. So those three questions, I think if we weave them together in some aspects, I think it's quite interesting. Let's start with the question from the lady around the recipient of risk or the active driver to stop. And then I would quite like to look at the instruments that are out in the world and where do they conflict with each other. I think that's a really important position or discussion to have. We could probably have it for 15 minutes longer. We won't, because there is lunch. So I want to start with you, Jean, around the position of within the NGFS, and then how that translates into the real world instruments, and then where does climate action and nature act in conflict with each other?
So I think it's good to have this kind of two different views of the issue. To be completely honest, when I look across the NGFS membership, I don't see people opposing the two of them. I see people looking at it, understanding it's both with regard to basically impact and dependencies. And we very much have the same framework to think about that we have for climate transition risk and physical risk, so to speak. So in fact, it's not one camp or the other. It's the two of them, and it's understanding also that there is not that much that we as central banks can do. We can go a long way in some dimensions, but honestly, the whole problem requires a whole of government approach to it, and that's also something that needs to be well understood. With regard perhaps to the instrument question, I'm afraid that without policies, to me it's more of a risk discussion than an instrument discussion. And I wish it would be otherwise, but I fear that at this current juncture we are really more looking at risk and stemming out of dependencies and so on. But there should be, to me it's a bit of the same question that the adaptation finance issue. It's difficult to build a business model out of that, even though it's critical.
Thank you very much, Karen. And if you could actually, I think also maybe start with the climate action versus nature action, and do they conflict with each other?
They can do, yes. So sometimes they can, as examples you gave. Also biofuels is another obvious one. So in our work for the Transition Plan Taskforce for the UK government, one of the recommendations we made that has been adopted into the guidance that's been put out is that one of the things companies should think about in developing their net zero transition plan is the potential impact on nature and any risks associated with that, negative impacts on nature, and what safeguards they will put in place to manage those risks. So it's beginning to get at that problem, identifying where there are trade-offs. There's lots of complementarities too, but there are some trade-offs. So beginning to sort of get those out in the open and think about how to manage those trade-offs going forward. I think that's the first step, and then we are going to need government to think about that as well in terms of the policy frameworks they put in place to drive net zero and nature positive transition going forward. On some of the other questions, in terms of the question about the recipient of risk versus the impact, I think this is really critical, because I think some of the issues that came up earlier this morning highlighted where there's sometimes a bit of a trade-off between the existing main mandate of central banks and regulators versus climate and nature as well, to an even greater extent perhaps, where I think that trade-off is mainly probably in the short term. In the long term, they become the same problem in many ways. But in the short term, there may well be a trade-off. And so we've been arguing actually in the UK context that financial regulators should be given a statutory objective to deliver net zero alignment, because the UK government has made a commitment for the UK to become the first financial centre to deliver to be a net zero aligned. I don't know if that's going to be true or not, but it seems to make sense that financial regulators would be given the job of making sure that happens. So it increases that in their prioritisation list and in terms of the resource they can throw at that question. So I think that is a really important part of what we should be expecting of financial regulators going forward. And so on the final question around instruments, what is happening in the transition plan conversation space is whether that's on the net zero transition, but it's about how can we credibly demonstrate that we are engaging with companies to improve their performance such that we can continue to invest in some companies which don't have great fossil fuel record but who are working hard to tackle that and investing in new solutions. And if we can get a credible framework for that through the transition plan framework, that kind of thing can be applied to the biodiversity transition as well. And we know there are some funds out there that are already looking at incentivizing the nature or biodiversity transition as well, and looking at what requirements they could set of the companies they invest in to ask them to show that they are making improvements in terms of their nature impacts. So I think there's bits that are being done that could help to develop these instruments in due course, hopefully fairly quickly.
Thank you. And Judson, to end with you, if you could just touch on those questions, perhaps starting with the instruments question and anything you would like to add. And
well, I'm between you and lunch, so let me just focus on instruments and
Perfect.
put out a few ideas. Something we've been looking at as UBS, whether we can develop blended finance solutions, perhaps using philanthropic capital from some of our ultra high net worth investors, investing in things like, say, mangrove restoration. Maybe you're potentially tapping into the value of carbon sequestration, potential other ecosystem services. So finding sort of creative solutions to get to that sort of monetization point that we mentioned before. Other interesting instruments that have been developed, debt for nature swaps are coming back into focus. They've been around for a long time, but certainly in the case of nature, they can be used quite an effective way, particularly as we move into a higher interest rate environment with concerns around the debt sustainability of emerging markets. And finally, I'll put in a plug for some work that's going on in Jean's organization with one of my other hats, which is as the industry chair of the IAF, the Institute of International Finance's Sustainable Finance work. We're actually working on a blended finance handbook with the NGFS to be published later this year, and so I'm hopeful that'll also be able to feature not just climate-based solutions, but broader nature-based solutions in that work.
Perfect. Well, hopefully when that comes out, we will be able to, we'll be able to convene a discussion on that as well, because I think that there'll be for sure interest from those in the room and also those who are listening virtually as well. So I just want to thank everybody for listening to this really interesting discussion and also for contributing to the discussion and the speakers here. So please do head out for lunch and then we'll reconvene in 1 hour for the afternoon sessions. So thank you, everybody.